At one point, Internet Explorer was the internet, not a way to access it, not one option among many. The internet. If you wanted to go online in the late 1990s and early 2000s, you opened Internet Explorer. That was it. That was the whole choice. The little blue E was as fundamental to computing as the power button. Most people didn't even know other browsers existed. Some people didn't know browsers existed at all. They just clicked the blue E and the internet appeared. At its absolute peak in 2002 and 2003, Internet Explorer held over 95% of the global browser market. Let that number sit for a second. 95%. In a world where any market share above 30% is considered dominant, IE had nearly the entire planet using it simultaneously. It was the most complete monopoly in the history of consumer software. And then, over the next 15 years, it became the single most mocked piece of technology ever created. The butt of every developer joke. The villain of every web design horror story. The browser people used exclusively to download a different browser. By the time Microsoft finally put it out of its misery in 2022, the announcement was met not with sadness but with memes. Thousands of them. People celebrated. Developers threw parties. The internet did not mourn Internet Explorer. It threw a funeral and laughed. How does the most dominant piece of software in history end up as a punchline? Buried inside Microsoft's decisions from the late 1990s through the 2010s is a story about what happens when a company wins so completely that it stops trying. Not a story about bad engineers or evil intentions. A story about the specific, catastrophic consequences of believing that a market you've already won doesn't need to be competed for anymore. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how that happened. And once you do, you'll recognize something uncomfortable. The same pattern is playing out in software you're using right now, made by companies that are just as dominant today as Microsoft was in 1999. But first, you need to understand what Microsoft actually built, because Internet Explorer wasn't always a joke. For a brief window in the mid-1990s, it was genuinely impressive. The browser wars began in 1994 when a company called Netscape released the Navigator browser and essentially invented the modern web browsing experience. Before Netscape, the web existed, but it wasn't really usable by normal people. Netscape changed that. It was fast, it was visual, it could display images alongside text, and within months of its release, it had become the way ordinary people experienced the internet for the first time. Microsoft, at this point, had missed the internet entirely. Bill Gates and his leadership team had been so focused on operating systems and productivity software that the rise of the web had caught them almost completely flat-footed. In 1995, Gates wrote an internal memo called the Internet Tidal Wave that is now famous precisely because of what it reveals. Microsoft's most powerful leader admitting in writing that his company had underestimated the internet and needed to pivot immediately to catch up. What followed was one of the most aggressive corporate pivots in tech history. Microsoft licensed browser technology, assembled a team, and released Internet Explorer 1.0 in August 1995, less than a year after Gates wrote his memo. It was rough, it was slow, nobody was particularly impressed. But Microsoft had something Netscape didn't. It had Windows. In 1995, Windows was on over 90% of the world's personal computers. Every single one of those computers was a potential Internet Explorer user because Microsoft started bundling IE directly with Windows for free. Where Netscape charged users to download its browser, Internet Explorer was simply there, already installed, waiting on your desktop the moment you turned your computer on. This is the decision that changed everything. Not a technical breakthrough, not a superior product. A distribution advantage so overwhelming that it made competition almost impossible. Netscape's business model depended on people choosing to download and pay for its browser. Microsoft's model was simpler. Make IE unavoidable. You don't have to be better than your competitor if your competitor has to convince people to find them, while you're already on the desktop of every computer sold on Earth. By 1998, IE had overtaken Netscape as the most used browser in the world. By 2000, Netscape was essentially dead as a commercial product. By 2002, IE had 95% of the global market. The browser war was over. Microsoft had won. And that's where the story gets interesting, because winning is exactly what destroyed Internet Explorer. Before I continue, if you want to understand how a product goes from total dominance to universal ridicule, subscribe to Behind the Tech right now. Every single week, we break down the hidden decisions behind the world's biggest tech collapses. Without further delay, let's get back to the video. Here's what happened the moment Microsoft won the browser war. They stopped developing Internet Explorer. Not officially, not publicly, but effectively, yes. The IE team, which had grown to around 1,000 people during the browser wars, was dramatically reduced after Netscape collapsed. The thinking inside Microsoft was straightforward and, given the circumstances, almost logical. The browser war is over, we won. The browser is now a feature of Windows rather than a product in its own right. So why maintain an army of engineers working on something nobody is competing with us on? IE6, released in 2001, was the last major version of Internet Explorer for 5 years. 5 years. In technology terms, that's geological time. The web was evolving rapidly. New standards were emerging. Websites were becoming more complex. Developers were pushing HTML and CSS in directions nobody had anticipated. And Internet Explorer was sitting still. And then came the security problems. IE6 had been built in an era when the security threats facing web browsers were relatively limited. By 2003 and 2004, the landscape had completely changed. Viruses, spyware, malware, and phishing attacks had become mainstream threats, and IE6 had become the preferred entry point for all of them. Its market dominance made it the most attractive target for every malicious actor on the internet, and its aging security architecture made it genuinely dangerous to use. Think about what that means in practical terms. The browser installed on 95% of the world's computers had become a security liability. Using Internet Explorer to browse the web in 2004 meant exposing your computer to risks that were not hypothetical. They were routine. Tech publications started publishing articles with titles like, "Is Internet Explorer safe to use?" The answer, increasingly, was no. Microsoft eventually responded. IE7 arrived in 2006, 5 years after IE6. IE8 in 2009. Each version was better than the last. But here's the problem. And this is the critical thing that most people miss when they tell the Internet Explorer story. By the time Microsoft started taking browser development seriously again, the damage was done. Not to the product, to the reputation. In 2004, while Microsoft was still sitting on IE6, a group of former Netscape engineers released a browser called Firefox. It was faster than IE. It was more secure than IE. It supported web standards that IE ignored. And crucially, it was built by people who genuinely cared about browsers as a technology rather than as a feature to bundle with an operating system. Firefox didn't win on distribution. Microsoft still had Windows. Firefox won on merit, on word of mouth, on developers recommending it to friends and family, on tech publications endorsing it, on the simple fact that when you used Firefox, the web felt different, faster, cleaner, more reliable. By 2008, Firefox had claimed around 20% of the global browser market. IE was still dominant, but the monopoly was cracking. And then Google released Chrome in 2008. Chrome was not just a better browser than Internet Explorer. It was a fundamentally different philosophy about what a browser should be. While IE had been built to be a feature of Windows, Chrome was built to be fast above everything else. Google's engineers had identified that browser speed was the single biggest factor in user experience and had engineered Chrome specifically around that insight. Pages loaded faster. JavaScript ran faster. The browser itself started faster. Everything was faster. Chrome also had something else going for it. Google had spent years building the world's most used websites, Search, Gmail, YouTube, Maps, and could ensure those products worked perfectly in Chrome while occasionally working slightly worse in other browsers. It wasn't always deliberate, but the effect was real. If you used IE, YouTube occasionally had issues. If you used Chrome, it didn't. That's a powerful incentive for the world's most popular video site to teach its billion users to prefer a particular browser. By 2012, Chrome had overtaken Internet Explorer as the world's most used browser. The most dominant piece of software in consumer tech history had been dethroned in under 4 years by a product that didn't exist when the decade started. But even that isn't the full story of how IE became a joke. The market share loss is just the outcome. The joke, the specific, visceral, developer hatred that turned Internet Explorer into a cultural symbol of everything wrong with software, came from something more specific. IE didn't just fall behind. It actively made the web worse for everyone who had to build things for it. Web developers in the late 2000s and early 2010s were caught in a nightmare that's almost impossible to explain to someone who didn't live through it. Every other major browser, Firefox, Chrome, Safari, had agreed to implement web standards in ways that were consistent and predictable. Write a piece of CSS code, and it would render the same way across every browser that followed the standards. But Internet Explorer had its own interpretation of almost every standard, its own box model, its own CSS quirks, its own JavaScript behavior, its own way of handling HTML that didn't match what anyone else was doing, which meant that every website had to be built twice, once for the real world and once for Internet Explorer. Developers spent enormous chunks of their working lives writing special code, IE hacks they called them, that did nothing except fix problems that only existed in Internet Explorer. There were entire websites dedicated to cataloging IE bugs. There were JavaScript libraries built specifically to paper over IE's incompatibilities. There were job listings that listed IE compatibility experience as a required skill, because making things work in IE had become a specialist discipline in its own right. The hatred was not irrational. It was not technophobia or brand loyalty to a competitor. It was the specific, earned, daily frustration of having to do twice the work because one browser, the most widely used browser, refused to follow the rules that everyone else had agreed on. Every hour spent writing IE hacks was an hour not spent making the actual product better. Every website that looked broken in IE was a user experience failure that the developer hadn't caused but was blamed for. The joke was not really a joke. It was a coping mechanism. Here's the part of this story that almost nobody talks about. And it might be the most important part. Microsoft knew. Not in some vague corporate awareness way. They knew specifically and in detail. By the mid-2000s, internal Microsoft research was showing that IE's reputation had become a serious problem. Developer sentiment surveys were damning. The IE team itself was advocating internally for the resources and commitment needed to fix the problems. And slowly, painfully slowly, some of those fixes came. IE 8, released in 2009, genuinely improved standard support. IE 9 in 2011 was actually a decent browser, significantly better than its predecessors, reasonably fast, much better standards compliance. IE 10 and IE 11 continued the improvement. By 2013, the actual product, the software you could download and install, was competitive in ways it hadn't been for a decade. But none of it mattered, because the joke had already been written. The developer community had a decade of justified anger baked into its institutional memory, and no amount of genuine improvement was going to dislodge that. Every time a developer opened a browser compatibility testing tool and saw IE failing, the joke was reinforced. Every time a client asked, "But does it work in Internet Explorer?" the joke was reinforced. Every time someone posted an IE meme and 1,000 developers shared it, the joke was reinforced. Microsoft had spent years in the 2000s not caring about its browser's reputation, and by the time it started caring, the reputation had taken on a life of its own that the product couldn't control. In 2015, Microsoft released Windows 10 with a brand new browser called Microsoft Edge. IE was still available, but no longer the default. Edge was fast, modern, standards compliant, and genuinely good. It was everything Internet Explorer should have been a decade earlier, Nobody used it, not immediately, not willingly. Users who had been burned by trusting Microsoft's browser once had no interest in trusting Microsoft's browser again. Edge launched to near universal indifference. The browser market had consolidated around Chrome, and no amount of good engineering was going to shake that without the kind of patient, multi-year trust building that Microsoft had neither the appetite nor the reputation for. In 2019, Microsoft made a decision that was both an admission of defeat and a genuinely smart pivot. They rebuilt Edge from scratch, not on Microsoft's own browser engine, but on Chromium, the open-source foundation that powers Google Chrome. The new Chromium-based Edge, released in January 2020, was excellent. Fast, compatible, memory-efficient, full of genuinely useful features. By most technical measures, it matched or exceeded Chrome. And slowly, gradually, it started gaining users. Not through nostalgia for Microsoft browsers, but because it was actually good. On June 15, 2022, Microsoft officially retired Internet Explorer. The little blue E that had once defined how the world accessed the internet was gone. After 27 years. The internet's response was immediate, unanimous, and entirely predictable. Memes, jokes, obituaries written in mock solemnity. Developers sharing stories of the worst IE bugs they'd ever encountered. A Japanese company that had included IE in its product contracts rushed to update those contracts. A South Korean government department had to scramble because its systems were built entirely around IE and literally couldn't function without it. That last detail is worth sitting with for a moment. Internet Explorer's final legacy was not innovation, not a technology that changed the world. It was the discovery, at the moment of its death, of just how many critical systems around the world had been built around a browser so dominant in the early 2000s that entire government and enterprise workflows had been constructed around its specific quirks. Quirks that were incompatible with every other browser on Earth. So here's the lesson that Internet Explorer actually teaches you. And it's not the one most people tell. Most people say IE died because it was bad. But that gets the causation backwards. IE didn't become bad and then lose users. It won so completely that it stopped trying to be good, and the stopping trying is what made it bad. The dominance came first. The decay followed from the dominance, not despite it. The 95% market share was not a sign of health. It was a warning. Because any company with 95% of a market has essentially no competitive pressure to improve, no signal from the market telling it to work harder, no rival forcing it to innovate. The monopoly that looked like total victory was actually the moment the clock started counting down. And right now, one browser holds roughly 65% of the global market. It's fast, it's reliable, it's genuinely good. The engineers who build it are talented and motivated. Everyone uses it. You probably opened it today. Pay attention to how it treats you over the next few years. Because that's how 95% of the world felt about Internet Explorer in 1999. And the joke took about a decade to write itself. Like if this made you look at your browser differently. Comment the software you think is the next Internet Explorer. The thing that's so dominant right now, it's already stopped trying. Subscribe to Behind the Tech for the real stories behind the world's most powerful tech companies every single week. Click on this video right here, how Skype became the world's most hated app. Because what happened to Internet Explorer and what happened to Skype are the same story told from opposite directions. One won too much and stopped caring. One was handed a winner and broke it. The outcome was identical. I'll see you there.